Nature is so near. The rooks in the college garden, like agile babies, still speak the language of feeling. By the tower, the river still runs to the sea and will run, and the stones in that tower are utterly satisfied still with their weight. And the minerals and creatures, so deeply in love with their lives, their sin of axity excludes all others, challenge the nervous students with a careless beauty, setting a single error against their countless faults. Oh, in these quadrangles where wisdom honors herself, does the original stone merely echo that praise shallowly, or utter a bland hymn of comfort, the founder's equivocal blessing on all who worship success? Promising to the sharp sword all the glittering prizes, the cars, the hotels, the service, the boisterous bed, then power to silence outrage with a testament, the widow's tears forgotten, the fatherless unheard. Whispering to chauffeurs and little girls, to tourists and dons, that knowledge is conceived in the hot womb of violence, who in that late hour of apprehension and exhaustion strains to her weeping breast that blue-eyed darling head. And is that child happy with his box of lucky books and all the jokes of learning? Birds cannot grieve. Wisdom is a beautiful bird, but to the wise often is it denied to be beautiful or good. Without are the shops, the works, the whole green country, where a cigarette comforts the guilty and a kiss the weak. There thousands fidget and poke and spend their money. Eros Paidagogos weeps on his virginal bed. Ah, if that thoughtless, almost natural world would snatch his sorrow to her loving, sensual heart. But he is Eros, and must hate what most he loves. And she is of nature. Nature can only love herself. And over the talkative city, like any other, weep the non-attached angels. Here, too, the knowledge of death is a consuming love, refuses the low, flattering voice that rests not till it find a hearing. W. H. Auden wrote this poem, Oxford, in December of 1937. Auden, a native-born Englishman, had graduated from Oxford with an undergraduate degree in English in 1928, almost a decade before the publication of this poem. He wrote Oxford upon returning to England after volunteering in the Spanish Civil War. As Sean Grass writes, many middle-class intellectuals from Oxford and Cambridge, quote, volunteered on the Republican side in droves, hoping to fight the good fight, only to find once in Spain the war's political complexities bore no resemblance to their expectations, end quote. Auden was one such student. Oxford serves as a conduit for Auden's disillusionment and provides a commentary on the relationship between the educational institution and political idealism. Biography author Mendelssohn wrote that Oxford is still a bitter valedictory to Auden's time at Oxford. Auden remembers Oxford with a cold tone and heavy, bitter words, and writes this poem as a warning. He sets the scene by contrasting the unsullied natural world with the structured, civilized architecture of the university, beginning, quote, nature is near, end quote, and then contrasting the rooks who still speak the language of feeling with those stones, utterly satisfied still with their weight. In the second stanza, Auden sets nature and the stones against the students, who scurry about with their countless faults while the minerals and creatures exist in axity, Greek for apathy. By this second stanza, Auden has moved from the most general, the natural world, to the architecture of the institution, and then to the people inhabiting the university. He then hones in on the spirit of the university in the third stanza, which Auden depicts as stately, yet not entirely good or trustworthy. In these quadrangles where wisdom honors herself, Auden writes, echoes a bland hymn, an equivocal blessing, language reminiscent of Shakespeare, who coined the term equivocal to describe something that was two-voiced, ambiguous, or deliberately deceptive. In this third stanza and the following, Auden utilizes two key devices, the first being religious language. It's noteworthy that at this point in life, Auden has not yet converted from atheism back to the faith of his childhood. Auden wrote in an autobiographical haiku that his thoughts pottered from verses to sex to God without punctuation, and such is the case in Oxford. Auden uses religious phraseology such as hymn, blessing, and testament in his description of the founder's exhortation to its students. implying there's a connection between organized religion and formal education, both institutions that ultimately serve as an accessory to oppression. Quote, "The widow's tears forgotten, the fatherless unheard," end quote. Auden references the intellectual movement towards helping the war, criticizing promises that the sharp sword receives all the glittering prizes, wealth, material goods, and power to silence outrage, that is, authority won by their experience in war. Auden then turns to a second device, anthropomorphism. Auden describes the institution's promises in characterizations reminiscent of classic mythology. Knowledge is conceived in the hot womb of violence, who in a late hour of apprehension and exhaustion strains to her weeping breast that blue-eyed darling head. Again, Auden relays the idealism of intellectualism, that violence broods knowledge, and experience in war is the true path to enlightenment. Auden calls this sentiment into question, however, asking, is that child, knowledge, happy? And warning that wisdom is a beautiful bird, but to the wise often it is denied to be beautiful or good. Speaking from his own disillusionment after returning from the Spanish Civil War and feeling helpless and betrayed, Auden implies that wisdom is not all the delights it's sometimes so cheerfully painted as. In stanza 7, Auden turns from these deity-like characterizations of knowledge, violence, and wisdom to the base, uncivilized world, untouched by these higher elements. Without are the shops, the works, the whole green country, where a cigarette comforts the guilty and a kiss the weak. These earthly pleasures bring comfort, as the ordinary world bustles about their everyday business. While, Auden writes, Eros Paidagogos weeps on his virginal bed. This phrase is a combination of two Greek terms, Eros, the word for love, and Paidagogos, the term for trusted slaves in Greco-Roman culture, charged to supervise educational and moral development of young upper-class sons. Auden's imagery evokes pederastic connotations, as Eros weeps with a strong and perverse desire for the natural world. The 8th stanza, with Eros wishing that thoughtless and almost natural world would snatch his sorrow to her loving sensual heart, parallels the 6th stanza's image of violence clutching knowledge to her weeping breast. All this imagery serves to reinforce not only Auden's overarching criticism of the educational institution and intellectualism as deceptive and corruptive, but to also draw larger conclusions about the dichotomy between the civilized, educated world and the natural, untouched world, which it seems humankind is caught between. This theme of the rift between humankind and nature repeats throughout Auden's works. In the final stanza, Auden returns to Oxford, referencing that aloof structure, the non-attached angels that weep over the city. Auden normalizes this characterization of Oxford as typical of any city. Like any other, here too, he writes, the knowledge of death is a consuming love. People yearn to know mortality and strife as the teacher and source of knowledge. Auden ends with an allusion to death. The low, unflattering voice as that final end for humankind, which the natural heart may resist but ultimately rests not till it find a hearing, until it claims its hearer. And so the poem begins and ends with the city, first enchanting intellectuals with its promises of glory, but ultimately ending in death, as death comes to all in time. How very modernist. Ironically, despite this socio-political commentary on the institution, using Oxford as the exemplifier, Auden would return to Oxford as a lecturer and professor of poetry in 1956 and teach there for 5 years, and ultimately retired to Oxford at the end of his life to write. Perhaps Auden appreciated this as the ultimate irony, returning to the very place that caused such disillusionment in his young years. Regardless, Oxford serves as an ode to Auden's intellectual maturation, as well as to a warning to those who may be lulled away from the natural world into naive idealism by civilized, institutionalized modern culture.